right, hello and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our friends around the world. My name is Jeff Mitchell and I work here at Rhodes Scholar, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture, The Dark Side of Sedentary Life, the Prehistory of Contagious Diseases. And today you'll be hearing from Dr. Thomas Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman is an associate professor in archaeology at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey, teaching Anatolian and Eurasian Archaeology since 2003. He holds a Ph.D. in Prehistoric Archaeology from Regensburg University in Germany. So, without further ado, let's have a warm virtual welcome for Dr. Thomas Zimmerman.
Jeff, thank you very much. Very warm welcome to all of you. Good morning to the United States. Good evening from Ankara. So for the coming 30-something minutes, I will take you on a bit of a troubled journey. Last week, when I was presenting here, again in the scope of the Rhodes Scholar Virtual Lecture Series, we talked about the mystery of settling down, of sedentary life, why people settle down at all, and why they abandoned a lifestyle that they successfully led for more than 2 million years, actually. Today, we have to talk about the dark side of sedentary life, and it's a bit of a troubling and, of course, very painfully actual topic we are dealing with. We are in the middle of a pandemic. It's not the first. It won't be the last, but that's the way it goes. And well, microorganisms, bacteria, viruses are here on this planet for at least 3.5 billion years. So they are much longer around than we are. And well, we, to a certain extent, coming to terms, live with them together. But every now and then, we are struck by such a global event. And well, the trouble actually started about 12,000 years ago. And things that we are still dealing with, nasty diseases we are still dealing with, like rubella, like chickenpox, like measles, just to mention the better known ones. They originate in something that started about 12,000 years ago. And this is where we'll take you back here again for the coming minutes. And first of all, clarify a bit the great historic turning points in the evolution of contagious diseases and pandemics. Well, the most recent one actually has to do with globalization in its initial stage, the European expansion after AD 1500, with European regions and later on nations setting out, colonizing the world with all beneficial and definitely not so beneficial side effects, and the spread of viruses, of microorganisms, of contagious diseases here. Then, when we go a bit back further a bit in time here, we have the age of the early empires, the Roman Empire or the Chinese Empire, just to mention two examples here, with the movement of soldiers, trade and exchange on first regional and then global scale. And this coincided, of course, once again, with the spread of contagious diseases and triggered epidemics and also pandemics here in later historic times. However, the initial starting point here is the advent of agriculture and animal husbandry, about 12,000 years ago. This is where the trouble started. And someone who is a bit more famous than me, probably, Professor Jared Diamond, which I think most of you know because of his seminal publications, amongst the better known, of course, Guns, Germs, and Steel. In his important essay he published back in 1987, he talks about the worst mistake in the history of the human race, which is the switch to sedentary life, because according to his view and the view of other anthropologists and also archaeologists, this is the beginning of social inequality. This is the beginning of organized violence and warfare, and also the starting point for the spread of previously unknown or previously not so present diseases here on first a regional and later an interregional and finally also a global scale. So what happens here 12,000 years ago? Here we are again with 10,000 BC and the advent of sedentary life and agriculture here in this particular region, the so-called Fertile Crescent. Here again, just to visualize this a bit more efficiently. So we are talking here about a region which encompasses the Eastern Mediterranean, so the southern Levant here, up to the Syrian plains and what's nowadays part of Turkey, East and Southeast Anatolia, and here down the Zagros mountain ridge in nowadays Iran. This is the place where we have the first sedentary communities, the first communities who start taming plants and also animals. Just to give you one example that I also talked about briefly in the previous week, but today I will talk about it in a different context. We have here a very early Neolithic village, one of the earliest we have actually in the world, Körtüktepe, here in nowadays southeast Turkey, which is excavated now for 1.5 decades, dated back to the 10th millennium BC. And what you see here from this aerial photograph is an accumulation of round dwellings. So it's interesting to note once again that sedentary life always starts with round buildings. Here we have some examples of these round huts here built side by side. And just to give you an impression of how we have to imagine these buildings here. So it's like, round huts with a conical roof here made of wood with a central post to support the roof, but it's not temporary anymore, it's solid. And the people are there to stay, to dwell, and to plant things, to grow crops and herd animals. I'll talk about this again in a few minutes. Another example here that I want to illustrate very quickly comes from what's nowadays central Turkey, the southern Anatolian or southern central Anatolian plateau site that you probably heard about here because it's definitely listed in a great number of touristic books, but also school books and of course scientific literature, Çatalhöyük, which is sometimes paraphrased as the oldest city in world history, which is not completely wrong, but also not completely right. Here we have a very nice artistic rendering of Çatalhöyük in southern central Turkey, which is called a Neolithic supersite because careful estimates expected several thousand people, and more boldly stated estimates expected up to 13,000-14,000 people lived here together at the same time. And you see the architecture is different. We have densely clustered agglutinated buildings made of mud brick with a flat roof. And this takes us actually to the first issue that we have to talk about here when it comes to contagious diseases and later on pandemics. So there are some major factors that I want to talk about here, and this starts actually with settling down in terms of crowding. This is the first big change that we have here 12,000 years ago, that different from hunter and gatherer communities, from nomadic communities, which pitch their tents at one point and then they move on and leave the waste behind, leave the trash behind, now the situation changes from scratch because a greater number of people stay put at the same place. And then we have the trouble with waste, human waste, animal waste. So crowding is the first big issue here. And crowding triggers eventually what we call density-dependent diseases. Protozoa, bacteria, microorganisms which trigger stomach-related or digestive diseases like dysentery or diarrhea. And this is what we do in archaeology here. We are virtually digging in the dirt most of the time. Here we have some typical Neolithic waste pits with not only pottery and other things that were discarded, but of course, lots of human waste and also animal waste. And you know very well, and it's the same nowadays, that such waste pits are anything but healthy environments. And if you think that these larger numbers of people stay put, stay together, live together here for not only a few weeks and months, but several years, decades, centuries, then this becomes a big problem. And that's what we see in archaeology here, that the crowding triggers this density-dependent diseases, which is one important factor here in the story of contagious diseases. Then we come to the second issue here, which is crop domestication, which at first sight doesn't sound very dangerous or unhealthy, but what are we doing here? Or what did the people do here? So crop domestication or agriculture means that you take a certain species, let it be crops like einkorn, emmer, and barley and alike, but also lentils or pulses, and then you start some controlled breeding. So you keep them in custody and grow them in custody, which means that you are reducing the genetic variation, the natural genetic variation of the crops, which means you make them more vulnerable to pathogens, which of course in the first step affects the crops themselves. But this is what people dealt with, they had to deal with as soon as agriculture started. So we have here, just to visualize this very briefly, examples of wild wheat, and then with controlled breeding in a way, or agriculture here, which evolves over decades and centuries and millennia. At the end, we have something which is technically genetically engineered. So we are doing this actually for thousands of years, but the fatal consequences is that there's crop failure because of this reduced genetic variability of this artificially grown crops in this early agricultural environment. So we have crop failure due to mildew, rust, ergot, St. Andrew's disease. It's an alternative name for it. But even if you harvested the crops and put them into the granary, the trouble doesn't end, because here you have insects, you have weevils, you have rodents against the problem with mildew, rust, and ergot. And in archaeology, we see that this was a constant problem in these early agricultural communities. There is a modern experiment that was carried out in Scandinavia a couple of years ago with a field that was not dusted, that was not protected with modern pesticides or other chemical stuff to avoid being infested with insects or with mildew, rust, or whatever. More than 50% of the crops failed. More than 50% of the crops failed, which means that this would have been the end of average Neolithic village at this time. And this was a constant problem that people had to deal with. And this, of course, affects, we will see this also in a few minutes the health of the early agriculturalists. Now, this is actually the very heart or very core of the problem that we are currently struggling with, which is the current pandemic. Animal domestication has a bit of the same issues or the same problem that apply to the domestication of crops. When you take a group of animals out of their natural environment and start breeding them in custody, you play with the genetic code. You reduce the genetic variation and make these animals more vulnerable to illnesses, more vulnerable to pathogens. That's something that is also valid for the crop story that I told you just a few minutes ago. But the big trouble is that these bred animals, they become also hotspots for zoonosis, which means illnesses that are transmitted from animal to human, illnesses that transgress the species border. And this is something that is intimately related to animal husbandry. This is intimately related to animal breeding, which starts here about 12,000 years ago. Just to give you a few examples here. So we have the famous triple here, where domestication starts in the ancient Near East with sheep, goat, and most surprisingly, also the pig here, where we have very early evidence for actually failed pig domestication here in southeast Turkey, dated again to the 10th millennium BC. Pigs are extremely problematic to domesticate. Pigs are very intelligent and very social animals. And if you take them out of the natural environment, which is the woodlands, and you just cram them in pigsties, then this animal will panic, also for the simple reason that pigs cannot sweat. So what they do is they, when exposed to heat and sunlight, will start wrestling in the mud to cool their skin down. This is probably also one reason to think that pigs are very filthy animals, which is not really true, but you know, the story goes that pigs have to be avoided, especially here with food restrictions in the Near East. Be it as it may, we have here the goat and the sheep and the pig, which was started to be domesticated in the 10th millennium BC, and nowadays we share 46 illnesses with sheep and goats. Then we share 42 illnesses with the pig, we share 50 illnesses with the cow, and 26 illnesses with the chicken. So out of, I think, about 1,600 pathogens, at least, I took a note here, let me check, 800 to 900 are zoonotic. So are actually animal diseases which jumped ship, which transgressed the species border here and became also human illnesses. This is also something that we're actually dealing with currently. So this coronavirus is another example of a virus which was originally hosted by certain animal species, and at one point it adopted also to the human species. It jumped ship, as to say, and became this disease we are currently, or this virus which can trigger the disease that we are currently dealing with. We owe more to the fact that we started domesticating these animals. So sheep and goat domestication brought us measles. Very dangerous, you know, these child diseases. If you get them as a child, it's okay. If you get them as an adult, it's really, really dangerous. We owe smallpox to camel domestication, which took place here in the Middle East about 4,500 years ago. And we owe the famous, infamous influenza, the seasonal flu, to the fact that we kept keeping waterfowl in ponds in the villages. This is the time when this originally duck or waterfowl infection or viral disease also became a human disease. All right, then, well, just also to rectify an idea that was pretty present and repeated ever since, also in the 20th century, that Neolithic life was very healthy, also a bit of a romantic idea of a peacefully governed Neolithic village. This is pretty far from reality. So what we encounter here when we also collaborate, which we do, of course, frequently with physical anthropologists, is frequent signs of malnutrition. So Neolithic populations, Neolithic village populations were pretty badly fed. So this is only what we can here extract in terms of analyzing the fossil remains, the bone materials. We normally don't have the soft tissue at hand, which would give us more ideas about other diseases, but ancient DNA analysis gives us plentiful of information here of diseases which human population here, and in our case Neolithic populations, suffered from here about 10,000, 8,000, 7,000 years ago. So we have generally the effect of malnutrition. And then we have evidence for pellagra. We have evidence for riboflavin deficiency. We have evidence for thiamine deficiency, which can then trigger a very horrible illness, beriberi. This is all related to the lack of vitamin intake. So nutrition became pretty bad for a very, very long time. And we have other evidence coming from places, from sites which were first not inhabited, but were first populated by hunter and gatherer groups, which then became, or their offsprings or later generations, became farmers in the Near East. So we have a nutrition breakdown of food, of organic food, so lentils, pulses, all different kinds of wild fruits and vegetables. And for a hunter and gatherer population, let's say in the southern extent of the Fertile Crescent, so the southern Levant, they consumed an average of 150 different types of fruits, of lentils, pulses, legumes, vegetables, whatever, apart from meat. For Neolithic population, this dropped to about 14. So we have the fact that we have not a very ideal situation here in terms of secured nutrition of village population. And just to give you another fascinating fact here, there was a big study conducted 1.5 decades ago, I believe, for the Mediterranean basin and for the Near East, analyzing the average body height of both nomadic hunter and gatherer populations and sedentary populations, including the Neolithic, the Copper Age, and the early Bronze Age periods. And we have as a result the average body height of women, of females here, which were hunters and gatherers, which led a nomadic life, 12,000 BCE approximately, of 165 centimeters, 5.5 inches. Then we have males with an average height of 175 centimeters. Within 9,000 years, this dropped to 152 for women and 160 centimeters for men. This is another certain sign that something was not quite right here, that nutrition, stress, and other factors that I will very briefly summarize here at the very end of my presentation, they affected the overall health of the population quite badly. Something else that I want to mention here in the case of the trouble that we have with this new way of life is the fact that the world population here, which can be estimated before the beginning of the Neolithic, of about 4 million people worldwide, 4 million humans globally, let's say 12,000 years ago, they rose only by 1 million in 5,000 years, because about 5,000 BC, we have only 5 million people around on this planet. So this is actually contradicting any sane and reasonable statistical model. So we call this the Neolithic bottleneck, for the simple reason that we have a very, very low growth of human populations here on a global scale. And this is related by most scholars to the fact that too many people succumbed to these new types of diseases, epidemics, and later on, pandemics. When the Neolithic moved westward here from its original region here from the Near East, and then about 5,000 years later, we have the Neolithic package, or yeah, we can even call it the Neolithic ideology, imported here to Europe with a ready-made set of domesticated animals, of domesticated crops, and this way of life characterized by solid buildings, by sedentary life here. And this movement, of course, or the westward movement of the Neolithic doesn't only bring a new way of life to the still nomadic, still mobile population of then prehistoric Europe, which either assimilate or are eradicated actually here very brutally. This movement of the Neolithic also brings the diseases with them, alongside with a very dramatic altering of the environment. Just to give you one striking example here from a recent excavation at Istanbul here in northwestern Turkey, an excavation in course of the subway construction here. It was taking place a couple of years ago. We have a waterlogged environment here. So that's the reason why these tree stubs are so beautifully preserved. We see here an area deforested by a Neolithic community 7,000 years ago. There's a village nearby which was inhabited by probably 100, 120 people, but they deforested a huge area. So if you think that smaller groups of people, they cannot have such a big effect on the environment, think again. Actually, we are interfering, we are meddling with the environment ever since we embarked on this new way of life. And it also comes with other nasty aspects here of human existence. We have, since the Neolithic, alongside with plagues, with illnesses, with contagious diseases, warfare, organized violence and warfare on a grand scale. Just to give you one example of slain defenders of a village in Schlitz in Austria here, dated about 5000 BC. Here another example of a massacre here conducted on more than 400 individuals here of another Neolithic site. So this is the reality here. So the Neolithic was far from being a peaceful period of social equality, let's say. Well, after this rather depressing information, in the final minute of my presentation here, let's talk about something which is hopefully more encouraging and positive. Here, let me give you Edward Jenner, who has to be praised for having developed the first functioning vaccination, in that case, against smallpox. Nasty, extremely dangerous, a horrible disease which ravaged populations for thousands of years. And nowadays, as you know, at least smallpox is not something that we have to worry about too much, with vaccinations here conducted last big row in the 1960s, 70s here. And this is something that should provide us with an optimistic view here, that this is a difficult period for all of us. But the more we understand about it, the better it will be. And well, with a reasonable approach and a certain amount of sanity, we will also survive, we will overcome this period, and hopefully see each other, at least some of you here, as soon as it is possible again. In Turkey, it's the proverbial cradle of civilizations. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you very much for your attention and patience. I believe there will be some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zimmerman. That was really great, and very topical to the world that we're all living in now. So we are going to start off our Q&A session. Dr. Zimmerman, we had a question here from Frank, who said that sedentary life and urban centers also developed in Mesoamerica and the Andes, but there doesn't seem to be any suggestion of diseases forming there until the Europeans arrived. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, to tell you the truth, thank you very much for the question. I'm not a real expert on Mesoamerican archaeology. My colleague Charles Gates here from Bilkent might be able to tell you more about this, but actually, no. Well, at least density-dependent diseases and contagious diseases involving animals, and especially involving zoonoses. This is not a phenomenon isolated for the Near East. This is something that automatically comes with adopting this new way of life. For the time being, the earliest evidence still comes from the Near East, and then Asia, the Pacific region, and also Mesoamerica and Southern America is to follow. But it's inevitable, actually. As soon as you decide to settle down, you have to struggle with crowding. You have to struggle with waste in a previously unseen dimension. So this is the advantage of mobile communities. They just move on. So they cannot so easily contract any type of infectious disease, let it be waste-related diseases, or let it be zoonoses. But as soon as you change your way of life, this is what you have to struggle with. Of course, the situation for America, or for Mesoamerica especially, becomes much more dramatic as soon as the Spaniards arrive with a previously unseen pack of diseases, where Eurasian and European communities developed at least a certain level of immunity, but the populations here in the pre-colonial communities, they were not prepared. They had no immune system prepared for it. Well, this is probably something that we have to stress again. These nasty little thingies we are dealing with, also the coronavirus, this is something which is around here much, much longer than we are. So these things can adapt to new conditions much easier than we do. However, we learned to live together with these microorganisms. Well, in our body, there are millions of them, but they do not do any bigger harm. The problem with the current thing is that we don't have any natural defenses yet. This will change in the coming years, but currently we are exposed to it like a baby. And lucky us, there are much worse viruses around. The coronavirus is something one can handle to a certain extent. It still can get dangerous, as we know. But here, for the Americas, this is what I can share here, that the problem tripled, of course, as soon as the Europeans came. But there were definitely also such density-dependent diseases and zoonotic diseases around.
Now, was there any evidence, this was actually a question that was sent to us by Merle, was there any evidence in the any kind of early civilization who attempted to construct like viable plumbing and sewer systems once they kind of, were they even aware that these living conditions that they were putting themselves in were a hotbed for these viruses?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. Well, awareness takes time, at least when there are limited ways of interregional communication. So we have in later periods evidence for awareness of contagious diseases and measures taken against them. But this comes quite later. So to give you an example, in the later third and especially second millennium BC, in the time of the Assyrian Empire, we have written evidence, because there's then writing available, for soldiers being quarantined for a certain period of time, because they are suspected to carry a disease and people were aware that this is contagious, it's transmitted somehow. So they were kept in special quarters, and they were supervised, and they were controlled whether they develop any symptoms. So this is some type of awareness which comes definitely later on. We have also the, of course, nice story of disinfecting water with wine, which is done in classical antiquity. And here there was an awareness that microorganisms or microbes, there was no concept of this type of things. There was no germ theory at this time, but there was the connection made between a potentially dangerous contaminated water and a way to disinfect it, in inverted commas, with alcohol. This is what we have in classical antiquity. For previous periods, it's very difficult to tell, because we have no written evidence, we have no written sources, but we see the trouble here in archaeology with villages which were destroyed, which became deserted, and now with ancient DNA analysis, which gives us a much greater variety of information related to the fossil material. We see that Neolithic communities, also in Europe, as soon as the Neolithic way of life moved over there with the people, had several events related to bubonic plague, most probably, which kept larger patches of land and regions virtually deserted. So we had these events recurrently here in the past, and of course the casualties there were way higher than now with modern medical care, with medicine, and if best comes best, with vaccination.
Now, is there any evidence to support, I'm sorry, I just lost my place here. Is there any evidence, this is from Cynthia, that bacterial infections like the plague were also exacerbated by sedentary life?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so what I just shared with you, now with modern ancient DNA analysis, we see markers of certain illnesses much more clearly. So in previous decades, anthropologists, physical anthropologists, could track malnutrition, illnesses related to vitamin deficiencies. But now we can even reconstruct, depending on the quality and the state of preservation of the bones, what hair color the person had, what this person normally ate, whether this person could take copious amounts of alcohol or was not really good in digesting alcohol. This can all be extracted from information. And we see that these markers like plaques, now the bubonic plaque, for example, this is now also very evident for parts of Scandinavia, Northern Europe, Central Europe here in the Neolithic period, since 5000 BC especially. So there's definitely a relation of illnesses, contagious diseases, and epidemics here that broke out occasionally in relation to these sedentary Neolithic communities, for sure.
I'm seeing a lot of questions.
I should probably add, sorry, very quickly,
No,
I should probably add, this is not the only reason why people died a very early death, but there are other things that I mentioned very briefly, like organized violence and warfare, which we have since the Neolithic on a previously unseen scale. So there's insult added to injury, as to say.
No, that's great. That brings me right to my next question. I'm seeing we're getting a lot of questions about from folks who want to know the transition out of the Neolithic period. So we saw a big decrease in population. So what accounted for the increase in population, and do you think this sedentary lifestyle and the social structures that were set up, was that a cause for fighting amongst these civilizations and like these patterns of Neolithic warfare that we kind of see throughout history?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what we can also try, and in some cases it's successful, is to relate this occasional outbursts of violence and warfare, which we especially have in Eurasia and Europe, with battling for fertile grounds. That's definitely the case for Central Europe, where we have very strong evidence that there were horrible fights and no one was spared. So we have this mass graves filled with elders, with youngsters, with babies, with newborns. Everybody was eradicated for the sake of getting a patch of fertile soil or patch of fertile ground here. Well, in the course of time, we have a general decrease for the Mediterranean world and for Anatolia in size of the humans in body height. This then stabilizes, gets eventually better. Of course, there is then a gradual immunity against certain diseases, which is one important factor, but this takes time, as we all know. This takes a couple of generations eventually. There are other factors, the climate. We have climate changes, which is also a reason for a quicker spread of certain diseases, and also eventually a reason for the outburst of violence and warfare. We have so-called RCCs, which is rapid climatic changes, every millennium, actually, which can now be traced very nicely because of certain proxies, markers, sedimentation, ice cores in the Arctic region, which is a wonderful save for the environmental history of our planet. And now with modern technology, we can correlate, or we can try to correlate these things much more efficiently than it was possible in previous decades. So there are several, there's never only one reason, but there's always a combination of them. But let's say it's the battling for resources, it's a different concept of property, and it's eventually also climate change, which triggers diseases, epidemics, and also violence and warfare.
Well, that's great. Thank you. That really kind of puts things into kind of one of my last questions here. I think we have time just for one more. Okay. We have a question here from Leslie, who is just wondering, based off of your experience and your knowledge, what would be the best way to prevent a pandemic in the future, or is there a way?
There is no way. Well, I'm very straightforward here. This is what we have to deal with. And this is, as I said at the beginning, it's not the first one, it won't be the last one. You cannot really prevent this, especially not in this super globalized world that we live in, because this travels now much, much, much faster. in prehistoric and early historic times, movements were slower and gradual. So there was no high-speed communication at this time. There is no way to prevent it, but there's a way to meet these challenges and to react to them. And this is science, this is medicine, this is research, also baseline research, which is very important. And I think the current situation shows us that funding really has to go into science, into research, also history, last but not least, to understand the mechanisms, to understand the rhythm of these events much better and to react to them much better. We have to be realistic. There's no way to prevent it, but we are now in the 21st century in a much, 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 much better situation to react to this. If you think, oh, I want to travel back in time and experience the life of a Neolithic farmer or a Bronze Age smith, think again. You don't want to travel back. It's not the glorious past here. So it's really better now. We have to be very clear about this. So we are in a good situation. And this is the reason why I also try to give an encouraging message, an optimistic message at the end. With reason and knowledge and science and research, we can meet these challenges much more efficiently.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. I really appreciate that.
A pleasure, as always.
Thank you so much for your time here today. Everyone, I want to thank Dr. Zimmerman for his presentation. A big thank you to all of you for joining us here today. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.